Welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and today we will be going through my final wide receiver rankings, top 36 according to the thumbnail, top 38 in reality. As you can see, just have these guys in 3 tiers, so much more generalized tiers here, probably more accurate to the reality of the situation. But as we go through the video, I will point out how in other ways that I could have done some tiers or some sub tiers that could have been made. A little bit of information on the players, not going to go over them too much. This is mostly to get through the rankings, but you can see rankings as they get updated live up on my website, www.thefi4ge.com. There's a link down in the description if you didn't catch that. But also here you can you click up top. Here are some tabs that you can't quite see, I don't believe. Rankings, make it nice and simple, easy, intuitive there. To check out the rankings, you can click on these, you can print those off, but also I have a cheat sheet nice and prepared for you that's kept up to date via the most recent ADP and my, of course, most recent rankings. So there that is, check that out. And with any kind of cheat sheet, I do always recommend go through ahead of time and find any players that you like that are a little bit low on there so that you don't miss them. Give it a little star and asterisk, highlight it, whatever the case may be. Without further ado, let's just get right on into these rankings. Actually, real quick, I will be live as much as possible throughout the next week so that you can get some live reps in against other humans, because that's the best practice that there is for these draft situations. And so keep an eye out and come join us. And also, I mean, just this last Thursday when we went live on Thursday night, had 2 or 3, I think like 3 people come in while they were drafting and ask draft questions. So I'm just available for any questions also when I'm up live. So we're going to go through these first 3 tiers. I'm just going to put them into their tiers first, a little bit of information about them. Then I'm going to go back, put them into the rankings order, and just a little bit more information, and we'll end it there. So we're going to start off with A.J. Brown. Of course, he's going to be a tier 1 guy, and this has to do with the ceiling and the floor. I mean, it's just a good quarterback situation, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. Amari Cooper is a guy who I have as a 3rd tier guy, just very consistent, reliable. Don't know how great the ceiling is there in that Cleveland offense with Deshaun Watson most likely throwing to him. And I will say, whereas confidence level would have been pretty high in him just a week ago, with more news coming out about Deshaun Watson's health, that shoulder, I am actually legitimately do have some concerns about that. So I'm a little less confident in drafting Amari Cooper, but still fairly confident in it. Amon-Ra St. Brown is clearly a tier 1 wide receiver option. He is probably the single safest wide receiver in this draft. Game in and game out, he's just super reliable. Brandon Aiyuk is a tier 2 receiver for me. Now, I'm going to have him higher up in my rankings than you see mostly out there. Last year, he was a guy who I actually, for where he was going in drafts, thought that he might be a bust. He ends up falling in that draft, so I ended up drafting him, and he was very, very good for me. Because of the fact that there are contract things looming, and the fact that he could go to a different team, which may not be a better, probably won't be a better situation, to be honest, I should probably have him ranked a little bit too high, but I think he's going to end up with San Francisco, and I think that'll happen sooner than later, especially with how that offense performed 3rd week of the season. Preseason. There's probably more incentive in the building now to get things finished with Brandon Aiyuk than there has been yet. So Calvin Ridley is going to be up next, and he is a tier 3 wide receiver. Plenty of upside for that, plenty of downside too. You know, the quarterback situation, Will Levis, I assume he's overall in a worse situation than he was last year. Ultimately, I think he probably finishes in this 3rd tier and ends up, people who drafted him aren't going to be upset that they drafted him, nor will they have gotten something super, super spectacular, is my thoughts. CeeDee Lamb, I think you're going to get something super spectacular. I think sooner than later. I think things get figured out there, but there obviously are some concerns with that, but also he's obviously a tier 1 receiver. Chris Godwin is a tier 3 option for me. A good floor guy, tier 3. It fits. Chris Olave, I have as a tier 1 guy. This is obviously going to be higher than a lot of people have. Offensive system coordinator, new there, but I think in favor of Chris Olave. This is a system that tries to get the best player on the field the ball as often as possible, literally schemes up for that. So I have high hopes for Chris Olave in his 3rd season. Christian Kirk, some health issues as of late has pushed him down in my rankings a little bit, whereas I thought he was like a really good value for where he's getting drafted. Now, I just think that it makes sense. It's kind of like I just don't get overly excited about it anymore. But he should be good for you. Tier 3 makes sense. Cooper Kupp is a Tier 2 guy. One of this whole tier, I think, has the possibility of being a wide receiver 1, a top 12 wide receiver, top 13, wherever that kind of real cutoff is. And that's why it's a big tier for me. And I truly, you could take the entire tier 2, you could shuffle them up, put them in whatever order, and I'm going to have a tough time, like, just completely saying, oh, that's a terrible order to have them in. I think they all have a pretty good shot at being better than where they're drafted or being worth where they're being drafted. And Cooper Kupp is just as big of an argument as anybody. A little bit aging, but much healthier than last year as well. So we'll see how that looks. Davante Adams, Tier 2 guy, Tier 1 wide receiver talent. We all know that. But one of the worst quarterback situations coming into the season that doesn't look to have much high upside. We saw it last year, ended up in a wide receiver like 15, 17-ish range finish, and I'm not expecting a whole lot different from that this season. He's a Tier 2 guy with, I think, limited upside for me. Then we've got Deebo Samuel, Tier 2 guy for me. He has to remain very consistent. There are issues with, not consistent, efficient. So there are issues with that. There are issues with his consistency in this offense, an offense with a lot of mouths to feed, and how it operates is just some weeks, some guys might not be as involved, or things just might not go their way. And I think that's most true for Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, the guys who are most game dependent. The most inconsistency between the two of them. Devonta Smith, it's a guy who I'm similarly like not super excited, but also clearly makes it into this Tier 2. A little bit too inconsistent for my personal tastes, but we know that the upside is there. Good talent, a good situation surrounding him. Low chance of completely being a dud. Deontay Johnson is a Tier 3 guy, not as good of a situation surrounding him. Maybe the worst, second worst, kind of right up there in terms of quarterback situation in the NFL. Third worst. I mean, he's amongst this bottom 5 situation coming into the season. That's really concerning, but he's also going to get a lot of targets. So in that sense, a very good situation. High floor, ceiling, I could be very low. So that's the concern. DJ Moore is a Tier 2 guy. He's one of the ones who I'm the most excited for the possible upside, but there's a lot of mouths to feed there in Chicago, so we'll see how things go. There are question marks. DK Metcalf, clear Tier 2 guy. I don't get super excited, but everything's just above average to good to great there, depending on exactly what you think. Top 15, he should end up right in that area. Drake London, Tier 2, a little higher. This is a clear projection type of situation. We have not quite seen where we're drafting him, that kind of production yet, but we are expecting it with the addition of Kirk Cousins. So it just depends how well that goes or doesn't go, but we think that there's a really decent chance of Drake London being one of those top 12 wide receivers, and I have him ranked as so. Garrett Wilson, however, we have seen the talent, and we've seen him with one of those types of quarterbacks that can absolutely tank any kind of quality wide receivers output for fantasy purposes, and we've seen him still do fairly as good as you could hope for in those kinds of situations to shining at time periods over the last couple of years. So with Aaron Rodgers in town, we know worst case scenario that should be an average quarterback situation, which should mean that Garrett Wilson will be a fantasy stud. George Pickens is a guy who I do have concerns about. I think he's Tier 2 for a lot of people, given how broad I'm doing these tiers. But for me, for George Pickens, I'm really concerned about that quarterback situation, the consistency of it, his upside, his diva-ness getting in the way. There is definitely week in, week out upside. I just think that might be a headache where he might be on your bench one week when he goes off, and he might be in your lineup few weeks when he does not go off. So just be careful with that. Jamar Chase, as long as you can live with that, though, you're good, is someone who, last year, Cincinnati, both those wide receivers, was not the whole team, that offense. It was not their year. It was something else. I think Joe Burrow, back to health, I think we see the Cincinnati offense back to being on track of where we thought it was heading, and thus very excited about those players, and I think some of them could be even values even as high as where they're going. Jayden Reed, tier 3 guy for me. He was highly efficient last year, especially in the touchdown department, which is the main department where you big red flag. It was his first year. It was a lot of people's first year. It's a young team, so there's a lot of reasons to think that things can improve. And so that's why I still have him in my 3rd tier, and I'm not like, oh gosh, I'm so concerned about things. Even if efficiency goes down a little ways, everything else should be a better situation. It should be good. It should be good. He'll be a little bit hard to predict which weeks, but hopefully you get the best out of him throughout the year, and he could end up being pretty reliable. There's a definite chance that if there's anybody in this offense, I think the most reliable week in and week out guy should end up being Jayden Reed, but yet to see. Jalen Waddle, tier 2 wide receiver. We've seen him be a tier 1 guy in the past. I think he's finished as high as like wide receiver 7 a couple of years ago. That offense, was last year specifically trying to get Tyreek Hill a 2K plus year. They will not try to repeat that 2 years in a row. That's just not how it's going to work. So I expect Jalen Waddle to be more involved as long as he is healthy, and that should result, I think, in him being a good deal on draft day, wherever that ends up being. Exactly, I think his worst case scenario is that you're drafting him at his floor. Justin Jefferson, tier 1, barely for me, hanging on to that tier. This is kind of the same argument as Davante Adams, and as I talked about with Sam Darnold, he's the only guy to ever tank DJ Moore. I do have legitimate concerns about Sam Darnold. I also think, hopefully, over this last year and a half, 2 years, being in this offense could be a nice fit for him. I do think there's a chance that he will keep everything afloat there with this offense, and things will be okay. In which case, Justin Jefferson will be a big part of okay, to an extent that fantasy-wise, he should finish out in this area. But I don't like the ceiling, and I do think that there's one of those scarier floors for how high you're drafting him. I think a season like Davante Adams' season last year is quite possible. Keenan Allen is a tier 3 guy for me. I believe, a little bit higher on my rankings for Keenan Allen than others. I still have faith in him in this situation, much like we often talk about rookie quarterbacks liking their tight ends. I mean, they just like the reliable big targets, and that's what Keenan Allen is. Could he just fall off the face of the earth? I think that is possible, but I'm not betting on it. Blake Neighbors, tier 3, just barely. We could fit him into the tier 2. He's literally right along on the line there. And the difference here for him compared to some of the guys who have ranked higher than him is the quarterback situation. We know Malik Neighbors is going to get targeted the most. What does that turn into? What's the ceiling there is the biggest question. The floor is pretty darn safe, pretty good. So I do like Malik Neighbors a lot, but the ceiling is a big question mark still, and he's a rookie, so there should be some growing pains. Marquise Brown is a tier 3 guy who I think could definitely surprise and outdo this. The ceiling is very high, but I will say every week that he's missing time, every snap that Xavier Worthy gets to take that he doesn't get to take in that role in this offense hurts his outlook for the season, because it gives a guy like Xavier Worthy this window that he could just take a hold of it and carry throughout the season, and Marquise Brown could end up being kind of irrelevant, whereas in a different universe, he could have been very relevant. Marvin Harrison, tier 2 guy, high floor, don't know quite about the ceiling. That's my biggest concern for him. I do think he gets taken a little bit too high in drafts, not drastically too high. I think as of late, maybe he's pushed back a little bit as some running backs have maybe moved up a little bit. For a while there, he was getting taken in the first round for sure. I don't know that that's quite the same anymore. But, yeah, I mean, I just have some concerns about the ceiling. The floor, he's safe. I like him a lot, obviously. Michael Pittman, a very similar argument to Marvin Harrison. Overall, just a little bit more proven, but not as great of. There's more mouths to feed there, and there's a quarterback who's going to tuck the ball and run sometimes, take away touchdowns from everybody else on the team at times. So that just takes a little bit of the ceiling away as well. but he is very much in, to me, the same argument as Marvin Harrison. Once again, shuffle him up, whatever order you want, and I'm not going to argue against it. Mike Evans, he is clearly at the top of this group of guys who, a good floor. He also has a very high ceiling just because of his touchdown upside and what we've seen in the past. Year after year, he's done it. He's been there. It's boring to draft Mike Evans, but it's always paid off. So, I expect it to pay off. Until it doesn't, I expect that it will. That's just how it goes. So obviously have him ranked very highly. Nico Collins, another guy who is he's a little bit in a different argument. I think his ceiling is a little bit higher, but because they brought Stephon Diggs in, now there's more questions about usage and consistency that would not have existed if they didn't bring Diggs in. I'm not too concerned about it. I think Nico remains the number one target for CJ Stroud, gets the most work, is the most efficient. Well, maybe efficient would be Tank Dell, but is highly efficient, and maybe we're in line for, a better offense could still help him to have a better year than last year even. With Puka Nacua, I'm a little bit less sure about that, just because there's, I think, better competition in Cooper Kupp. We've seen that connection in the past be very, very, very good and strong. And, what does that look like once Cooper Kupp is healthy for Puka Nacua? We saw it down the stretch last year. I had them both on my roster. Every single week, I picked the wrong one. Is it going to be like that throughout the entirety of the season? Which one is it this week? Because it wasn't like, oh, they were both good, but one was better. It was a lot of times, it's like one of them went off, one of them stunk, and I kept picking the wrong one. Rashee Rice, tier 3 guy who I think has the upside of a tier 2. He would be ranked higher without any doubt. I say this with 100% confidence if it wasn't for the offseason issues that occurred. But as we approach the season, it appears like nothing's going to be happening this year. There's been no news on that front. Everything's pending legally. The NFL is going to wait for that to happen before they do their own investigation. And the NFL does not like to surprise teams. They don't want this situation to arise where they're in a situation where they're going to penalize a team that's entering the playoffs and they're going to lose their best player. They just handle things to avoid those types of situations because the teams want it dealt like that. They don't want any surprises midseason, especially any surprises come playoff time. And, it just makes sense business-wise for them to allow teams to prepare for things in the offseason when they know it's coming. So I think we're looking at a suspension of some sort next offseason for Rashee Rice. If he does not have a suspension by week 1, which I don't suspect he will, so over the next week, then I think you're pretty clear for this year. The worst case scenario, I think it would be one of those like, okay, we're going to just get a quick suspension in here, a 1 to 2 week thing mid-season, just accept it, and we'll, everything's swept under the carpet. We feel comfortable with where things were at legally, whatever. Don't fight it. Stephon Diggs. It's so far off. Why is it doing that? There we go. Tier 2, Stephon Diggs, just kind of on that borderline. But I do think that he is the most heavily targeted. I think he's the Mr. Reliable for CJ Stroud this season on, third down types of plays, short, mid yardage. You need a reception types of plays. I think that'll be Stephon Diggs, not the biggest ADOT in the world, but just Mr. Reliable, heavily targeted. I think that's how I have this offense working. Tank Dell, just kind of talked about that. I mean, look, here's the thing. Tank Dell, unlike Stephon Diggs, more volatile, could be inconsistent throughout the entirety of the year. That's a possibility if a lot of targets go Stephon Diggs' way. However, I do not throw this comparison around very often because Deshaun Jackson, one of my favorite wide receivers to ever play the game, absolutely love the guy. If there is anybody who's going to have that kind of ceiling, I think that is Tank Dell's ceiling. So the ceiling for Tank Dell, very, very, very high. Tier 1 kind of ceiling. That brings us to T. Higgins, who's in Tier 3. I almost put him in Tier 2 here just a moment ago. I really, really think that, this could end up being a value when we look at it at the end of the year. We talked about the Ja'Marr Chase. We talked about this offense when I went over Ja'Marr Chase. Down year last year for everybody. Expect things to look better this year. And I'll tell you what, if Ja'Marr Chase negotiations, whatever, don't come to some sort of conclusion that we think that it will come to over the next couple of weeks, T. Higgins over the next week, really. T. Higgins could absolutely be a steal, at least early on in the season, and really, really outproduce what you drafted him for. Terry McLaurin's another tier 3 guy, a little bit lower on the expectations list than T. Higgins, but just as high of a ceiling as anybody. Would it be a shock if he's somewhere as a top 15, 16 type of wide receiver? I don't think so. That's definitely in the possibility for him, but, the offense that he's on and everything, we're hesitant to have too high of expectations for Terry McLaurin, and that includes me. Tyreek Hill, clear tier 1 guy, best wide receiver last year. We don't need to talk about that. And Zay Flowers is in this third tier. He is a guy who I like the floor. I don't know about the ceiling. If they could utilize him a little bit differently, if you've seen reports in camp about him getting more vertical routes, that could go a long ways towards making him more productive, making that ceiling something more attractive. But I just don't know that that'll be the case. Solid first season. He's not a target of mine by any means, but I also think that he should be solid. Good floor guy. So I'm going to rearrange these into my rankings. We'll go over that really quickly, and I'll tell you where some tier breakoff points could have been. All right, so we have rearranged these within the tiers to match my rankings. So my first tier goes CeeDee Lamb, Ja'Marr Chase, Tyreek Hill. So there's the first question mark in there, I would say, for people. I really have a lot of faith in this Cincinnati offense turning things around. I think this Miami offense is going to need to create a couple more wrinkles that'll take just a little bit of the top away from, not even off of Tyreek Hill. Season long, it's just one of those changes that I think this season, it's just a flip. I'm just betting on Ja'Marr Chase this year. Monroe St. Brown, obviously Mr. Reliable. A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Justin Jefferson. So there's, the one that everybody could make fun of me for. Tier 2 begins with Brandon Ayuk, another question mark here, and I understand, especially with everything surrounding him, but this is one of those things where I don't know who the heck to put first, all the way up to Michael Pittman. Honestly, I could put Michael Pittman up here too. I could make the argument for it, and I don't think that it would be wrong necessarily for that argument, though I think that his ceiling shouldn't be drafting him above some of the guys just for ceiling purposes. So yeah, Drake London second, Nico Collins third there. I talked about that and why there's some concern surrounding that. Otherwise, he would be higher. He'd be borderline into that tier 1, but not quite. Just at the top of this list. Mike Evans, we know that. Devontae Adams, Marvin Harrison Jr., Puka Nacua, Jalen Waddle, Cooper Kupp, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman. So there's where I could make an argument for a little bit of a tier change. I could also make an argument for Stephon Diggs and or Tank Dell to be force their ways up into that tier, be ranked a little bit higher. But DK Metcalf, Deebo Samuel, Devontae Smith, I don't think there's too many questions that they deserve to be into this argument here as top 15 types of wide receivers. And then Diggs, Tank Dell to finish that off. Which one will it be? Will it be both of them and Nico Collins? I don't know. You got to think somebody's going to disappoint, but also there is room, if the tight end doesn't have like a spectacular year, for all three of them to perform well enough to be good for fantasy. So as I said before too, you shake this up however you want. To me, it's a total muddled pie, and this is why I don't prefer to get my running back instead around this area, but I don't love the early portion of the second tier of tight running backs either, is that I feel not a whole lot different about Deebo Samuel than I do about Drake London. The difference is pretty minute, so if I can wait a round or two and get one of those guys instead, if there's another position that I prefer, then I'll do that. So yeah, a lot of unsurety in a good way amongst this entire group here. Bringing us to tier 3 where, my cutoff here is Malik Nabers, and that just comes down, like I said, the quarterback situation. To me, I cannot make the same kind of hopeful argument for Malik Nabers that I can for Nico Collins or Tank Dell, just because of the situation around him on that team. Amari Cooper, Mr. Reliable there. T. Higgins, Rashee Rice. So obviously we're in our third tier here. Keenan Allen, Terry McLaurin, Zay Flowers. I actually just did an update mid-video here to T. Higgins, Rashee Rice, Keenan Allen, raising those guys a little bit, dropping Zay Flowers a little bit, and bringing Terry McLaurin up another spot, which he's slowly moved up some spots. And Calvin Ridley was the one that I didn't quite move up. I could in a day or two. That was a coin flip right there for me between Zay Flowers and Calvin Ridley. Then we got Christian Kirk, Jaden Reed, Marquise Brown, George Pickens. Obviously, we know I'm low on him. Chris Godwin, Deontay Johnson, who I'm fairly optimistic about the floor for Deontay Johnson. So I think that this tier, you could put Malik Nabers into a tier all on his own, or into a tier up to like Rashee Rice. I think those first four are kind of the ones who I have the most optimism for. Then we get into an area where I have a little bit of doubt, all the way up to, technically I would say, to Jaden Reed, and then I get a little bit more hopeful but concerned from Marquise Brown through Deontay Johnson is how it is. So hopeful, concerned, hopeful but concerned would be maybe the way that these break down in this group. So there we go. Those are my wide receiver rankings. Once again, you can find them up on the website, www.theffforge.com. And other positional videos will be coming out through the week. And look for me live for mock drafting purposes throughout the week. I will be live as much as I can be to help you get some practice against other humans, which is the best practice you can get. All right, peace out.